They called me a charity case, right there, in front of 500 people, in a room full of crystal chandeliers and men in tailored tuxedos. My son's business partner pointed at me across the table and laughed. Called me a charity case. I sat very still. I set down my water glass carefully so it wouldn't shake in my hand. And then I looked at him. This man, red-faced and smug, still chuckling like he'd said something clever, and I said quietly enough that the table went silent to hear me, "Do you know whose name is on the deed to the building your company operates out of?" He stopped laughing. I want to tell you how I got to that room, because nothing about that night makes sense unless you understand where I came from. And I mean that, where I really came from. My name is George Alderman. I'm 63 years old. For most of my adult life, I drove a '94 Chevy pickup truck with a cracked rear windshield that I patched with packing tape. I wore work boots, so old the rubber had separated at the toe on the left one, and I'd glued it back 3 times with construction adhesive. I clipped coupons every Sunday morning at the kitchen table with a pair of scissors that had belonged to my mother. If you saw me at the grocery store, and plenty of people did, in that small town in western Pennsylvania, you probably assumed I was a man who didn't have much. You'd have been right once, and then you'd have been very wrong for a very long time. I just never bothered to correct anyone. My wife June passed when our son was 4 years old. Pancreatic cancer. She was 31. I was 32, standing in a hospital parking garage at 2 in the morning, trying to figure out how a man becomes a father and a mother at the same time, overnight, with no instruction and no one to call. Her parents were gone. Mine were aging and 3 states away. We had a mortgage, a car payment, and $1,100 in a joint savings account. I won't dwell on those years. I don't want your pity. I never have. I'm telling you so you understand why I made the choices I made later. I worked construction for a decade, framing mostly. I was good at it. I had a mind for angles and load bearing, and I could read a blueprint faster than most men twice my experience. When my son Nathan started school, I started picking up side work estimating for a small residential developer named Hatch, who was always underbidding and losing money. I told him where his numbers were wrong. He hired me as his project manager. 2 years after that, Hatch had a heart attack and his wife wanted to sell the business quickly. She sold it to me for $400,000, which I financed by convincing 2 separate banks and 1 private lender that I was worth the risk. I was. The business made $600,000 in profit its first year under my name. I kept driving the Chevy. I kept clipping coupons. Part of it was habit. Part of it was something I can't fully explain even now. A kind of superstition, maybe, that the moment I started acting like I had money, it would disappear. I'd grown up watching my father's hardware store go under. I knew how fast things could turn. But the real reason, the one I didn't admit to myself until much later, was Nathan. I was afraid of what money would do to him. I'd watched the kids in town whose parents had means, the way some of them moved through life expecting things, expecting softness, expecting the world to accommodate them. I didn't want that for my boy. I wanted him to know the weight of things, to understand that $1 represented an hour of someone's back. So I kept the house modest, kept the truck, kept the boots with the glued toe. Nathan went to public school, worked a part-time job at 16 bagging groceries, and when he got into Penn State, he took out loans because I told him, and I believe this still, that a man who earns his own education respects it differently. What I got wrong, and I have thought about this more times than I can count, is that I let him believe we were struggling. I let the lie go too far and last too long. I told myself it was character building. What I didn't account for was what that lie would cost him in the rooms he later walked into. Nathan was brilliant. He got his MBA. He went to work for a mid-sized commercial real estate firm in Philadelphia, and inside of 5 years, he had developed a reputation for deal-making that was starting to pull real attention. He met a woman, Claire, whose family had money, old Philadelphia money, the kind that doesn't announce itself but is quietly everywhere. Her father, a man named Doyle, was the sort of man who assessed other men's fathers before shaking hands. I knew it the moment I met him at a dinner at their house in Chestnut Hill. He looked at my jacket, a navy blazer I'd bought at a Kohl's clearance rack in 2011, and his expression did something small and involuntary, a fractional tightening. He covered it fast. But I saw it. I didn't say anything. I ate my dinner, complimented Claire's mother on the lamb, and drove home 2 hours in the dark, thinking about whether I was being stubborn or principled or just an old fool. I decided I was principled. I kept the blazer. Nathan and Claire got engaged the following spring. I was happy for him. Genuinely, completely happy. Claire was sharp and kind, and she looked at my son the way June had looked at me, and that was enough. More than enough. The engagement party was held at the Doyle family home, about 60 people. I wore the blazer. I drove the Chevy, which I parked down the street because I didn't want it next to the Audis and the Lexuses in the driveway. I know how that sounds. I'm telling you what I did, not defending it. At one point during the party, Doyle gathered a small group of men near the fireplace. Claire's uncles, a couple of her father's golf friends, Nathan's new business partner, a man named Sterling. I was included in the circle, technically, the way you include a piece of furniture. Sterling was a few years older than Nathan, third-generation Philadelphia, the kind of man who wore his confidence like a second suit. He was telling a story about a deal he'd almost lost and how he'd salvaged it, and at a certain point he glanced at me. I was holding a glass of sparkling water and wearing my Kohl's blazer, and he said, in that way some men have of being insulting while appearing friendly. No offense, Mr. Alderman, but I imagine this world is a little foreign to you. A few people smiled politely. Nathan, across the room, didn't hear it. I looked at Sterling and I said pleasantly, "You might be surprised." He laughed. Doyle laughed. The moment passed. But something settled in me that night, something quiet and cold and patient. The Corporate Achievement Gala was Nathan's firm's annual event, Black Tie, held every October at the Bellevue Hotel in downtown Philadelphia. That year, Nathan had closed the largest deal in the firm's history, a mixed-use development project worth close to $90 million. The gala was, in large part, a celebration of that deal. His name was on the program. His face was on the promotional materials in the lobby. He asked me to come. I was proud of him. I want to be clear about that. I was so proud of that boy I couldn't speak the week before the event without my throat tightening. I thought about June. I thought about the hospital parking garage. I thought about all the Sunday mornings clipping coupons at the kitchen table with my son sitting across from me eating cereal, both of us just trying to make it to the next week. I drove to Philadelphia in the Chevy. I had a perfectly good suit at home, a charcoal wool suit, bespoke, that I'd had made in 2018 for a real estate closing where the other parties expected a certain appearance. I wore it exactly once, but that night I wore the blazer, the Kohl's blazer, and slacks that were clean and pressed but visibly off the rack. I parked in a garage 3 blocks from the Bellevue because I didn't want valet. I want to explain this without making myself sound noble, because I don't think it was entirely noble. Part of it was still the same stubborn superstition. If I dress the part, I become accountable to the part, and then something will go wrong. But part of it, if I'm honest, was that I wanted to walk into that room as myself. Just George Alderman. Just a man in his 60s in a blazer he bought on clearance, whose son had just done something extraordinary. I wanted that to be enough. It wasn't enough. Not for Sterling. The dinner was 10 courses, and the room was everything you'd expect. White tablecloths, flowers that cost more than my first car, men with the particular ease of people who have never had to glue the toe of a boot. Nathan was at the head table. I was seated at a round table near the middle of the room with Claire's family and Sterling and his wife, a polished woman named Audrey, who spent the evening speaking to everyone slightly over their heads. Everything was fine until the third course. Sterling had been drinking steadily, not sloppy, but loosened. He was in the middle of a story about his own deal-making history, and he made a joke. I don't even remember the exact words. And then he looked at me and added, for the table, nodding at my blazer, "We brought Nathan's dad along tonight. Scholarship program." He smiled. Audrey touched her pearls. Two of Claire's uncles looked at their plates. One of them laughed, a short, uncomfortable laugh that was really just a nervous exhale. I felt it land. Not in my chest, the way it would have when I was younger. Lower than that, something old and settled. I set down my fork. I picked up my water glass and I held it for a moment. "Scholarship program," I said. "Come on," Sterling said, still smiling. "I'm kidding. No offense, George." "None taken," I said. And then I set the water glass down and I said evenly, to no one in particular, but loudly enough for the table to hear, "Does anyone know who owns the building Nathan's firm is headquartered in?" Sterling blinked. "That's the Caldwell property on Walnut. I think the firm leases the Caldwell property," I said, "is owned by a Delaware LLC called Alderman Capital Partners, has been since 2009. Silence. "The building on Arch Street where your company stores its secondary records," I said, looking at Sterling now, "is also Alderman Capital Partners. So is the parking structure on 17th, where your firm has monthly contracts for 12 spots. So is the mixed-use property in Fishtown that you and Nathan's firm are currently in preliminary negotiations to develop." Sterling's mouth opened. Nothing came out. "I own 43 commercial properties in Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey," I said. "My portfolio last year was appraised at $212 million. I have a bespoke suit at home that I've worn once. I drove here tonight in a 1994 Chevrolet pickup truck." I paused. "I prefer the truck." The table was completely silent. Across the room, I could see Nathan had heard something. He was watching our table from the dais, and his face had gone very still. Sterling put his fork down. His wife looked at him. One of Claire's uncles let out a long, slow breath. "I'm sure you were kidding," I said to Sterling. "And I want to be clear, I'm not offended. I want to make sure you understand that fully. I'm genuinely not offended." I looked at him steadily. "But I do think you should know who you're sitting next to." I didn't tell Nathan what happened at dinner that night. I didn't need to. He'd watched the table from across the room, and he'd seen Sterling's face change, and he came to me after the speeches and said quietly, "Dad, how much do you actually own?" I told him. He sat down. He was quiet for a long time. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. I had rehearsed this question for years without knowing I was rehearsing it, and when it finally came, I found I didn't have the tidy answer I'd imagined. "I was afraid," I said. "I was afraid that if you grew up knowing you'd stop working, and then you'd never know what you could actually do, and I'd never know either." He looked at me for a long time. "Did you know," he asked, "what I could do?" "No," I said. "That's the honest answer. I didn't know. I hoped, but I didn't know." He nodded slowly. He didn't hug me right then. He nodded slowly. He didn't hug me right then. He wasn't ready. That came later, in the parking garage, when I was getting into the truck, and he appeared out of nowhere and put his arms around me and didn't say anything, and I didn't either, because what was there to say? We'd both lost June. We both made it anyway. That was the whole story. I'll tell you what happened with Sterling. 2 weeks after the gala, Nathan's firm entered formal negotiations on the Fishtown development. Sterling was the lead on his side. On the third day of negotiations, the seller's representative, who worked for me, though Sterling didn't know that yet, presented the ownership documents. Sterling went pale when he saw the LLC name. The deal closed. Sterling was professional throughout because he's a smart man, and smart men understand when the ground has shifted. He has not, to my knowledge, made a scholarship program joke since. Doyle called me the week after the gala. He asked if I would have lunch with him. I said yes. We met at a place of my choosing, a diner in my town, not Chestnut Hill. He drove 2 hours. He ordered the same thing I ordered, which I found unexpectedly touching. He told me he'd misjudged me. I told him I understood. We didn't become close friends, but we became something. 2 old men who'd both made their money the hard way and had different ideas about whether to show it. I respected him for making the drive. Claire, for what it's worth, had never cared about my blazer. She told me as much at Thanksgiving that year while we were doing dishes. I knew you were hiding something, she said. I just thought maybe it was a health thing, something you didn't want Nathan to worry about. I laughed. It wasn't that. I know, she said. You were protecting him. I was wrong, I said. Partially. She handed me a dish to dry. He turned out okay. He turned out better than okay, I said. He turned out like his mother. She smiled and didn't say anything, which was exactly right. I still drive the truck. I had the rear windshield replaced last spring, real glass, not packing tape, which felt like an enormous extravagance. But I was cold in the winters, and 72 is too old to be cold in your own vehicle. I bought new boots. I still clip coupons, though I'm honest enough with myself now to admit it's not about the money. It's the quiet of Sunday morning, the scissors, the smell of the paper. It's June's kitchen. I'm keeping that. Nathan and Claire have a daughter now, my granddaughter, Bea, who is 14 months old and has June's eyes and Nathan's stubborn jaw and absolutely no patience for anything that isn't immediately interesting. She is the best thing in my life. I drove to Philadelphia on her birthday with a toy that I picked out myself and paid for with cash, which I understand is irrational at this point. But some habits are not about practicality. I think about what I would tell a younger man, a 32-year-old standing in a hospital parking garage trying to figure out how to be enough. I would tell him, you will make mistakes. Some will be in the direction of too much and some in the direction of too little, and you will spend years not knowing which is which. You will get some things right completely by accident and some things wrong with the very best of intentions. Keep going anyway. There will be a night, maybe, when a man in a room full of crystal chandeliers looks at your jacket and decides he knows everything about you. Let him. He doesn't. And somewhere between who he thinks you are and who you actually are, that's where you've been living all along. Quietly, steadily, with your name on more doors than he'll ever count. That's enough. That's more than enough. I've had a lot of time to think about that night at the Bellevue. The way Sterling's face changed, the way the table went completely still. I don't replay it with any satisfaction. Or maybe I do, a little, and I'm trying to be honest with you about that. But the part I keep coming back to isn't Sterling at all. It's Nathan, in the parking garage afterward, standing next to the Chevy with his arms around me and neither of us saying a word. That's the thing about cause and effect that nobody explains to you when you're young. It doesn't announce itself. You make a choice to work 1 more year, to keep the old truck, to stay quiet in a room where people have decided who you are. And you don't see what that choice builds until decades later, when you're standing in a parking garage with your son and the weight of everything you both survived is just sitting there between you, wordless. I made mistakes. I want to own that plainly, letting Nathan believe we were struggling when we weren't. That was a lie, even if I dressed it up as a lesson. Children deserve the truth about their circumstances. What I should have given him was the work ethic without the fiction. I confused hardship with wisdom, and those aren't the same thing. Hardship is just hard. Wisdom is what you choose to do with it. What I got right, I think, was refusing to let fear make my decisions. When June died, the easiest thing in the world would have been to fold, to let other people raise Nathan, or to coast on whatever small savings we had, or to convince myself I wasn't capable of more. Instead, I got up every morning and I learned things I didn't know and I took risks I wasn't sure would pay off. Not because I was brave, I wasn't most of the time, but because there was a little boy eating cereal across the kitchen table who needed me to figure it out. That's not courage. That's just love with no other options. And what Nathan did with that, the drive, the deals, the $90 million project with his name on it, that wasn't my doing. That was his. I gave him the conditions. He built the life. I think that's how it's supposed to work, when it works. Sterling called me a charity case because he looked at a blazer and decided he understood everything. That kind of thinking, judging the whole from a single visible piece, is lazy, and it's costly. It cost Sterling that night. It costs people in smaller ways every single day, in every room where someone decides too quickly who matters and who doesn't. Intelligence isn't about what you accumulate. It's about what you're willing to examine, including your own assumptions. I'm 63 years old. I have a granddaughter named Bea with her grandmother's eyes. I still clip coupons on Sunday mornings. I replaced the packing tape on the truck's rear windshield with real glass, which I consider personal growth. If there's anything I pass on to anyone listening, any father driving home in the dark trying to figure out if what he's doing is enough, it's this. Character is not what you perform when people are watching. It's what you build when no one is. Sterling saw my blazer and saw a verdict. He missed 43 properties and 30 years of quiet, relentless work. Don't be Sterling. And don't spend your life trying to prove yourself to Sterlings either. Just keep building. The right people will eventually walk through the right door and see exactly what you've made. That's all it takes. And sometimes it's everything.